Imagine a world without paper, without computers, without even writing. Yet people still kept detailed records of their lives. We'll follow the tools people used to remember, count, prove, and argue, from bones to libraries, and see why they mattered. One of the earliest known examples is a small bone marked with tallies, a glimpse of humans turning memory into something physical. It wasn't the start of all data, but it shows how far back this impulse runs. From clay tablets to punch cards and magnetic tapes, each step built on the last. And some of these early methods might surprise you. They were sometimes faster or even more reliable than later technologies. To see how it all began, we need to look closely at a bone carrying marks from over 20,000 years ago. The Ishango Bone, deep in the Congo Basin, near the shores of Lake Edward, archaeologists uncovered a striking artifact, a small bone covered in deliberate notches. Known as the Ishango Bone and estimated to be around 18,000 to 20,000 years old, it is one of the oldest examples of humans leaving behind a physical record of numbers. The bone itself, most likely the fibula of a baboon, displays 3 distinct columns of tallies carved with quartz tools. These columns suggest organization, not random scratching, making it one of the earliest tally devices we know of. The Ishango Bone raises a simple but powerful question. Why would a community of hunter-gatherers carve notches into bone in the first place? For groups living by the cycles of hunting and gathering, reliable memory wasn't always enough. Keeping track of how many animals were taken in a hunt, or how long it had been since a full moon, was information too important to leave entirely in the mind. Carving marks into a hard surface gave that memory an external form, something enduring, portable, and more reliable than speech alone. The wear patterns on the Ishango Bone suggest it was used over and over, which hints at its role as an everyday tool for its owner. While we can say with confidence that the marks were intentional, what exactly they meant is still debated. Some scholars point out that one column appears to contain 60 notches, a possible echo of lunar cycles or seasonal observations near the equator. Others remark that certain groupings look like doubling sequences or even prime numbers, though many caution that these patterns might be coincidental. Another theory proposes that the marks serve simply as tallies, used for counting days, animals, or possessions. Still others suggest a combination, that the bone may have been a personal counting stick tied to lunar observations. The truth is, no consensus has emerged, and each interpretation reflects both the bone's intrigue and its mystery. What stands out is how carefully those notches were made. Microscopic examination shows that sharp quartz blades were used to carve them, producing clean, deliberate incisions. This craftsmanship was far from careless. It reveals skill and attention to consistency. That care supports the idea that these notches carried meaning, intended to be read, or at least understood by others. And if they were meant to be shared, that makes the bone not just a private memory aid, but a small step toward external communication. The Ishango Bone also complicates our assumptions about where and when complex number sense began. For a long time, much of the credit for mathematics was attributed to Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Greece. Yet here, in Central Africa, people made marks that suggest an early and independent practice of numeric thinking thousands of years earlier. Whether counting moons or tracking supplies, the impulse behind the Ishango Bone was to take intangible concepts, like time or amount, and mark them into the physical world. It's worth noting that the bone was not found in isolation. Archaeologists unearthed it among harpoon points and other stone tools, situating it within the life of a lakeside community. These people were fishing, hunting, and using advanced technology for their time. The Ishango Bone may have fit into that same toolkit, a specialized device for making sense of the patterns that structured their lives. And while we cannot point to cities or states here, we see evidence that mobile societies were already capable of abstract record-keeping long before agriculture solidified. Some researchers draw connections between the Ishango Bone and similar finds from other parts of Africa and Europe. For instance, an even older baboon fibula from South Africa, about 44,000 years old, bears notches too, but arranged less systematically. This invites us to think of the Ishango Bone not as a random anomaly, but as part of a long tradition of tallying that grew more elaborate over time. It represents a later, more organized stage of something our ancestors had been experimenting with for tens of thousands of years. Interpretations aside, the Ishango Bone represents three key points. First, it is a material object, a bone cut with care, with 3 columns of notches placed with intent. Second, it dates back nearly 20,000 years, making it one of humanity's oldest surviving tally tools. Third, and perhaps most importantly, its purpose is uncertain. Was it an early lunar calendar? A tool for keeping accounts? A record bound to ritual or trade? Scholars continue to argue its case, which tells us something in itself. The bone is complex enough to generate real debate, and that debate highlights what makes the Ishango Bone so significant. It shows that the urge to quantify and give form to information is ancient. Long before agriculture, long before language was fixed in writing, people were marking numbers into bone. Those who used it probably could not have imagined the future of mathematics. Yet the act of carving numbers into the world represents a bridge between thought and data. It is as if this small bone carried in someone's hand was humanity's earliest notebook. That raises a question. If carving into bone could preserve counts and cycles, what happened when whole communities faced problems that a single tally stick couldn't solve? As societies began to expand and wealth was measured in fields of grain or herds of animals, memory and bone markings alone were no longer sufficient. So what came next when simple tallies weren't enough? Clay tokens and tablets. About 8,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, communities faced a new challenge. Farming produced more than people could immediately eat, and trade spread goods far beyond the home village. With surpluses piling up and obligations multiplying, oral memory or tally sticks were no longer enough. The answer came in the form of small clay tokens, hand-formed counters that stood in for goods. A cone might represent a measure of grain, while a sphere could stand for a jar of oil. As simple as they look, these tiny objects became one of humanity's first true accounting systems. Archaeologists have traced these tokens back as early as 7500 BCE. People initially carried them loose, perhaps in bags or jars, but that system soon showed weaknesses. Tokens could be misplaced, swapped, or questioned. To address this problem, communities developed bullae, hollow clay balls that held tokens inside. Before sealing the ball, each token was pressed into the damp surface, leaving an impression that showed exactly what was enclosed. If anyone doubted the contents, the bulla could be broken open, offering undeniable proof. It was a system that combined portability, verification, and transparency. Over time, the process grew more efficient. Instead of sealing tokens inside a clay envelope, people began pressing the shapes directly into clay tablets, The impressions of cones, spheres, and other forms created a surface record without losing the counters themselves. Eventually, scribes moved beyond impressions, drawing pictographs that represented the same items. These pictographs slowly became abstract, giving rise to wedge-shaped signs we call cuneiform. History remembers writing as a tool for literature and law, but its earliest steps in Mesopotamia led straight through fields and granaries. The transition from tokens to tablets gave Mesopotamian economies new precision. A farmer delivering barley to a temple could have his baskets translated into clay marks, which endured long after the grain was eaten. A merchant could have his jugs of oil guaranteed in writing, without hauling the goods around for proof. The most striking evidence comes from specific records. One clay tablet from around 3100 BCE lists beer rations distributed to workers at a construction site. It's essentially the world's first documented payroll, proof that wages, work, and obligation were already carefully tracked. Although at first there were only a handful of simple shapes, the range of tokens expanded dramatically. Cylinders, discs, miniature tools, and figurines all carried coded meaning. Archaeologists have identified hundreds of distinct token types spanning grain, animals, textiles, and other goods. This variety suggests a sophisticated economy where record-keeping had to distinguish not just broad categories, but exact products and measures. Token systems lasted millennia because they matched the needs of daily life, flexible enough for households and powerful enough for temples and city-states. The bullae themselves added security to transactions. A sealed clay ball could be stamped with a cylinder seal, an engraved stone rolled across soft clay to leave a signature pattern. These seals prevented tampering and carried authority, much like a legal signature today. Similar seals are found throughout Mesopotamia, showing how much trust depended on sealed clay. In disputes over land, trade, or shipments, the physical evidence of bullae and their impressions stood as a judgment no one could easily falsify. The invention was not limited to administrators in great temples. Excavations reveal tokens and bullae in domestic settings too. Some appear in ordinary households alongside weaving tools, suggesting that women may have used them to record textiles or food production. Others turn up in small villages far from Mesopotamian cities, showing that this approach to memory was accessible and valuable to common people as well as elites. Rather than being confined to bureaucracy, the system slid seamlessly into everyday economic life. Trade carried tokens and tablets across a vast geography. The Fertile Crescent saw the earliest widespread use, but counters have been unearthed from Turkey to Iran, Syria to Pakistan. Their appearance at distant sites shows the diffusion of Mesopotamian methods even before writing firmly spread. The resemblance between early Mesopotamian tokens and some Egyptian hieroglyphic symbols also suggests cultural cross-pollination. Ideas about representing quantities and goods were carried by merchants, borrowed by neighbors, and adapted to local needs. Even as writing grew dominant, the transition was messy. Some early tablets show a mix of impressions and pictorial signs, as scribes experimented with combining old methods and new. At times, corrections scratched into clay reveal moments of trial and error before consistency emerged. In essence, writing did not appear fully formed. It grew layer by layer out of the token tradition. Only over centuries did cuneiform become abstract enough to capture names, dates, and sentences, rather than just accounting marks. Mesopotamian record keepers also developed numerical refinements. They used a system based on 60, known as sexagesimal, alongside base 10 counting, allowing them to handle quantities, fractions, and measures with surprising sophistication. Clay tablets show early place value notation, a major step in the history of mathematics. These refinements weren't abstract musings. They were practical tools for reckoning land, harvests, and payments in societies that now depended on precision. Yet the system was not without limits. Tokens and early tablets could record quantities very well, but they struggled with abstraction. You could write how many sheep had been delivered, but not the story of the delivery. As states grew larger and economies more complex, the simple shapes gave way entirely to full writing systems. By about 1500 BCE, tokens had disappeared, replaced by tablets filled with script. Still, their fingerprints linger in the origins of accounting, contracts, and administrative record-keeping that define civilization itself. Recent discoveries keep adding texture to this story. In Syria, at Tel Brak, tokens were found stored in ceramic jars, a twist on the bulla system. In Turkey, tokens appear with early metal objects, showing how the system adapted to new tools and materials. Each of these finds reinforces how adaptable and long-lasting this method was. Wherever people needed to prove, count, or share information, clay provided a canvas durable enough to outlast millennia. The legacy of tokens and tablets lies deeper than their clay surface. They reveal something fundamental about human problem-solving. When minds faltered, people reached for objects to hold memory outside themselves. A sphere of clay represented oil, a cone meant grain, and together they formed a shared language that anyone in the community could recognize. That urge to externalize, first in clay, centuries later on paper, and now on screens, remains at the core of every advance in record keeping. In many ways, this was the real turning point. For the first time, information no longer depended on memory or storytelling. It could persist, be checked, and be verified by anyone. That shift created economies capable of growth and rules strong enough to bind communities together. But as trade and mathematics expanded further, the need for new tools didn't end with writing on clay. Another technology appeared that could speed up calculations themselves, making numbers easier to handle in the moment, and it would stay useful for thousands of years. The abacus merchants in the ancient world often faced the same frustrating situation. They needed to calculate quickly and reliably, but large sums or repeated transactions easily pushed mental arithmetic beyond its limits. To solve this, different cultures developed a tool that turned numbers into something physical. The abacus, whether made of beads, pebbles, or marks on a board, let users push counters back and forth to represent place values. It was simple, portable, and precise, which made it one of the longest-lasting calculation devices in history. Variants appeared very early, with archaeological evidence pointing to counting boards in Mesopotamia around the late 3rd millennium BCE. These were stone or wooden slabs with parallel grooves where pebbles could be slid to mark units and tens. Similar concepts surfaced independently in Egypt, Greece, and Rome. By about 500 BCE in China, the more advanced suampan emerged, with its familiar frame, rods, and beads arranged in 2 decks, 2 beads above the central bar and 5 below. This design reflected the Chinese number system and proved highly efficient for trade and taxation. Further east, the Japanese soroban streamlined the suampan centuries later by reducing the upper deck to 1 bead, making calculations even faster. Meanwhile, Russian merchants favored the shoti, where beads slid horizontally along wires. Each form looked slightly different, but all relied on the same principle: moving counters to embody numbers. What made these devices so practical was their tactile clarity. Each slide of a bead into position created a clear, physical confirmation of the number represented. Errors became less likely, and calculations could be broken down into repeatable steps. The Roman counting board, used widely in markets, provided one striking example. Traders scratched grooves into wax tablets and slid counters to keep running totals of goods, avoiding disputes during lively bargaining. In Asia, the abacus became central to commerce, education, and administration, its beads clicking out sums faster than most people could write numerals. Mastering the abacus required training. Apprentices learned to control the beads with precise finger flicks, and with practice they could add, subtract, multiply, and divide in rapid sequence. Multiplication that might have taken lines of written work became a quick dance of beads across the rods. Skilled operators routinely outpaced early calculators on routine arithmetic, and for many centuries, this was the fastest practical method for large-scale computation. Complex numbers, which existed beyond the range of what most people could visualize, became manageable and concrete. The abacus had uses far beyond the market. In China, astronomers employed it to support calculations of celestial events. Tax officials across empires leaned on it to assess harvest yields or tribute owed to rulers. In medieval Europe, related counting cloths or reckoning boards spread, where jetons, small tokens, were placed on a grid to track sums. Even the ordinary word counter traces back to these surfaces where transactions happened in front of customers and officials alike. Each culture adapted abacus techniques to match its number system. In China, the Swanpan developed alongside mental visualization methods. Students trained not only to use the physical device, but also to picture the beads moving in their mind, a practice that sharpened recall and calculation ability. In Japan, the soroban emphasized refined efficiency, removing needless movements so users reached answers with fewer flicks. In Russia, the shoti fit Cyrillic numerals, sliding horizontally instead of vertically. Despite regional differences, all designs revealed the same insight. Numbers could be manipulated physically, not just imagined. Centuries later, even as mechanical clocks and printing presses spread, the abacus endured as both a practical and educational tool. Traders relied on its portability. Small versions fit in satchels or could be folded for travel. Sailors took waterproof designs with beads on wires for use at sea. In towns and markets, an abacus needed only a steady hand and a flat surface. Its convenience kept it integral to everyday life long after writing and other record systems expanded. The durability of the abacus also reflected local craftsmanship. Chinese versions were typically constructed with hardwood frames and bamboo rods, while Mediterranean cultures sometimes used ivory or metal counters. In the Andes, the Inca developed the yupana, a grid of compartments filled with maize kernels or stones, adapting the concept to their environment and mathematical systems. Across continents, the diversity of materials underscored a universal idea. By moving physical objects in fixed positions, humans could reliably represent numbers and perform operations. Commerce continued to shape refinements. Persian merchants experimented with beads representing fractions, aiding currency and trade calculations. Arab scholars integrated the abacus into teaching algebra, demonstrating both practical and theoretical applications. European bankers in the Middle Ages adapted reckoning boards for complex currency conversions as trade networks widened. Still, reliance on bead and board methods meant progress eventually stalled at more advanced operations. In fact, in 1202, the Italian mathematician Fibonacci made the case for adopting Hindu-Arabic numerals in his Liber Abaci, partly by showing how much simpler advanced math became once freed from abacus constraints. Even so, Abaci remained deeply embedded in everyday life. Remarkably, they were still in active use well into the late 20th century. In Japan, metropolitan department stores trusted them through the 1980s as backup against power outages, their staff clicking beads faster than early electronic cash registers ticked numbers. In Russia, the shchoti survived in small shops through the 1990s, solid testimony to its resilience. In the United States, niche manufacturers continued producing abaci into the early 2000s, supplying accountants who valued the tactile audit trail of bead positions. Every move was visible. Every calculation could be retraced. More importantly, the abacus endured in schools. Teachers across parts of Asia continued to use it as a tool for early arithmetic education. Children practicing bead movements gained not only arithmetic proficiency, but also better understanding of place value and numerical structure. Training carried beyond childhood into competitive demonstrations where skilled practitioners performed rapid calculations. Today, one can still find contests in which competitors add strings of multi-digit numbers in mere seconds. One record-breaking performance showed 15 three-digit numbers summed on an abacus in under 7 seconds, evidence of the method's lasting effectiveness. The educational dimension is where the abacus connects most directly with the present. Its use remains recommended not because it outperforms modern calculators, but because it strengthens foundational mathematical thinking. The process compels learners to treat numbers as objects that move with rules. This combination of visual and tactile feedback builds lasting number sense. That pedagogical impact explains why abacus training programs are still active worldwide, and why museums and cultural institutions hold workshops with reconstructed devices. Artifacts themselves tell a material history. Intricately designed Japanese soroban from the 17th century, embellished with gold leaf, signal their role as status symbols as well as counting devices. By contrast, simple wooden versions from small shops bear grooves worn smooth by constant use. Excavations along trade routes like the Silk Road have uncovered hybrid designs, blending features of Chinese and Persian abaci, reminders of how commercial contact spread practical ideas. Each example marks the abacus as not just an object of calculation, but a thing embedded in daily and social life. The abacus's long life highlights something essential about human ingenuity. It offered a universal solution, one that answered the needs of farmers weighing grain, rulers levying taxes, merchants settling accounts, and students learning multiplication. In many cases, it remained more robust than the fragile alternatives. It needed no ink, parchment, or batteries. The calculation could be seen as it happened and checked instantly by anyone watching. For all its simplicity, the device contained the core of what makes external data tools so powerful: reliability, transparency, and shared understanding. By the time modern computing began, the abacus was already thousands of years old. Yet, its contribution remained visible, not only through direct use, but through influence on later mechanical devices and teaching methods. From counting stones on early boards to the elegant wooden soroban, The abacus reveals how deeply the physical handling of numbers shaped human history. It demonstrates that calculation does not begin with abstract symbols, but with our hands, eyes, and memory working together. And while abaci help people quantify and process the present, other practices of the ancient world focused on a different kind of uncertainty, the mysteries of the future. In times of doubt, people sometimes turn not to beads and boards, but to bones and fire. Oracle bones during the Shang dynasty in China, around 1600 to 1046 BCE, rulers developed a method of decision-making that left behind the earliest significant written records in Chinese history. These records are known as oracle bones, usually made from turtle plastrons, the flat underside of a shell, or the shoulder blades of cattle. Onto these surfaces, scribes carved questions. Diviners applied heat until the bone cracked, and those cracks were then interpreted as answers. The results of the divination, including the question and often the outcome, were inscribed on the same surface. This creates a unique cycle of asking, interpreting, and recording that stands as both religious ritual and bureaucratic record-keeping. The ritual process required careful preparation. Craftsmen smoothed and thinned the bone or shell, sometimes drilling small hollows inside it. Onto this surface, scribes cut questions such as whether rain would fall, if a military campaign would succeed, or whether a royal birth would be safe. A hot rod was then applied to the hollow until the surface cracked. Too little heat left no mark, too much risked shattering the bone. Once cracks formed, trained specialists interpreted them. The cracks carried symbolic meaning, often splitting in patterns that represented affirmation, denial, or more subtle possibilities. Inscriptions on the bone note not only the interpretations, but sometimes the later verification, whether the predicted rain or victory had actually occurred. What stands out about this practice is its structure. Tens of thousands of surviving fragments reveal a set pattern. Statement of the query, record of the outcome, and sometimes even annotation of accuracy. For example, one inscription poses the question, will rain come within the next 10 days? Months later, a follow-up note confirms whether rain actually fell. These records make oracle bones a rare case where predictions, interpretations, and results were documented together. The range of topics is wide. Questions survive about agriculture, military campaigns, the health of the royal family, hunting outcomes, and even treatments for headaches and toothaches. Taken together, they provide a detailed archive of concerns in Shang political and social life. The inscriptions carved on oracle bones are a milestone in the history of writing. They represent the earliest comprehensive corpus of Chinese script, with about 5,000 characters identified so far. Around 500 of these have been deciphered by scholars, and many show direct continuity into later Chinese writing. Some, like the ancient form of the character for rain, closely resemble the modern version, with droplets descending from a cloud. Others reveal the process of gradual change, beginning as pictorial sketches and slowly simplifying into abstract symbols. For this reason, oracle bones are not only historical records of ritual, but key evidence in the study of the origins of written Chinese. Divination practices themselves were orderly and systematic. Different bones were reserved for different classes of questions. Turtle shells were often used for matters of national significance, including military campaigns, harvests, or celestial events. Ox scapulae, by contrast, tended to record concerns of the royal household, such as births, illnesses, or ceremonies honoring ancestors. This division of labor implies a bureaucratic mindset in religious practice, categories of questions determined by both material and ritual. Within a single bone, diviners also imposed order. Cracks followed lines linked to yes or no answers, sometimes branching out to accommodate more complex queries. The bones also shed light on the structure of Shang governance. Some inscriptions include the names of diviners, and certain names, such as Kuei, who appears repeatedly, suggest prominent officials responsible for overseeing divination. This gives the impression of an organized administrative system where specialists held authority and where divination was not random fortune-telling, but an institutional practice. Far from isolated rituals, the bones were part of political administration and decision-making at the highest levels. Even though divination was rooted in belief, the record-keeping shows elements of accountability. Some bones plainly record predictions that failed. For instance, a bone might report a forecast of military success, followed by an acknowledgement of defeat. Others reveal repeated queries about the same issue over time, such as weather predictions made weekly before planting season. Rather than falsifying unfavorable results, the inscriptions captured them alongside the successes. This systematic tracking of queries and outcomes resembles, in some ways, the logic of modern data collection. Patterns were noted, regardless of the immediate usefulness of the prediction. Oracle bones also provide an extraordinary window into early Chinese knowledge of time and astronomy. Many inscriptions include dates carefully linked to the 60-day Shang calendar cycle. They sometimes record lunar phases or eclipses observed at specific times. One inscription from the 12th century BCE describes a lunar eclipse that modern astronomy confirms occurred exactly as recorded. These details not only affirm divine timing for rituals, but preserved accurate astronomical data. Questions on the bones extend beyond politics and weather into daily concerns and medicine. Records exist of illnesses and proposed treatments. Some identify fevers or eye diseases, while others mention remedies involving herbs. Certain treatments noted then still appear in traditional Chinese medical practices today. The inscriptions sometimes record whether a proposed cure aligned with divine approval, an indication of how treatment decisions were framed through ritual consultation, as well as empirical effort. Military affairs show up with striking detail. Oracle bones record enemy threats, troop deployments, and casualty estimates. One remarkable inscription details a contingent of 9,000 soldiers sent against the Qiang, one of the earliest known military headcounts in Chinese history. Others list enemy prisoners taken, or the success or failure of raids. For historians, these fragments represent rare direct testimony of Shang-era warfare. Environmental records also appear. Repeated questions about rainfall and drought allow historians to reconstruct Shang-era climate conditions. Patterns in inscriptions align with geological evidence of floods or dry periods in the Yellow River Valley. In this sense, the bones captured not only the concerns of the Shang, but a record of environmental conditions that would otherwise be invisible today. Ritual calendars shaped when bones were consulted. Many inscriptions link divinations to lunar phases, royal anniversaries, or moments associated with ancestors. Some bones display symbols marking certain cracks as particularly auspicious. Failed divinations required further rituals before repeating questions, and some bones bear evidence of multiple attempts marked side by side. The process followed traditional rhythms and rules, not casual or spontaneous questioning. The use of oracle bones did not vanish overnight, but declined with the fall of the Shang and the rise of the Zhou dynasty. Later rulers favored different techniques, such as divination with milfoil stalks, associated with the text known as the I Ching. Even so, the characters carved into bones carried forward, reappearing in inscriptions on bronze vessels and later in writing on bamboo slips. The continuity between Oracle bone script and later Chinese scripts reveals the enduring legacy of this early record-keeping system. Recent archaeological work continues to expand what is known. In 21, imaging technology identified faint traces of ink inscriptions on bones, perhaps a preliminary step before carving. In 2023, investigators uncovered a possible workshop containing prepared, unused bones, suggesting production was centralized and that skilled workers existed to support diviners at a large scale. These finds add context to how Oracle bones were not only ritual objects, but also products made and managed within an organized system. Some aspects of the bones remain controversial. A few show marks near fractures that do not appear natural. Some researchers have suggested that diviners may occasionally have guided or adjusted the cracks, possibly to confirm favorable outcomes. Others argue these marks were repairs or later damage. The question remains open, but it highlights the complexity of the practice and the potential for human influence. Importantly, scholars treat these hints cautiously rather than as proof. The legacy of Oracle bones can still be traced in language itself. The modern Chinese character for divination, bu, directly echoes the shape of a crack on a heated bone. Many terms relating to omens and fortune draw from vocabulary first used in this context. Even the word for history, shishi, may connect back to the role of Shang officials who were both scribes and diviners. Shang era practices thus contributed not just to writing, but to the very concepts describing record-keeping and the past. In the end, Oracle bones created more than divinatory records. They established a structured system that merged ritual practice with administrative logic. They showed a royal court systematically asking questions, recording answers, and tracking results. These bones are evidence of one of humanity's earliest attempts to make the unseen visible through data, blending belief and bureaucracy. Later societies would also search for accessible ways to document daily life, but outside royal courts and sacred rituals. Where papyrus was costly and bones were too sacred to waste, communities had to find simpler objects for everyday notes and records. Ostraka in the bustling cities of the ancient Mediterranean, what most people saw as broken pots became something far more useful. These fragments, called ostraka, were the scrap paper of their time, accessible, abundant, and democratic. Fired clay was everywhere, and when vessels shattered, their pieces transformed into ready-made writing surfaces. Anyone could pick one up, scratch a message, or jot down a note. Unlike papyrus, which was expensive, or parchment, which relied on animal skins, ostraka made writing possible for nearly everyone. One of the clearest demonstrations of ostraka's cultural weight comes from Athens. In the 5th century BCE, citizens practiced ostracism, an unusual democratic safeguard. If someone threatened the balance of power, the question of their removal came to a public vote. Athenians would gather in the agora and scratch the suspect's name onto pottery shards, the earliest form of ballot slips. Thousands of these votes have been found, each one marking the will of an individual. Among the most striking discoveries is a cache of 190 fragments targeting a man named Megacles, dated to around 471 BCE. The sheer number reflects a coordinated effort, perhaps even evidence of organized campaigning. The very word ostracism survives from this practice, a reminder that even fragments of clay could shape political life. Outside formal politics, ostraka capture something equally valuable: details of everyday living. Casual lists and reminders show up again and again. One Greek shard records an order for sacks of grain. Another names household supplies like oil, wine, and figs. Some pieces carry notes about debts owed or payments delayed, conversations that would otherwise vanish without a trace. Though the handwriting is uneven and varied, that variation itself is revealing. It suggests that literacy was not confined to elites or full-time scribes. Even if writing ability ranged from clumsy to practiced, ostraka let ordinary people translate daily concerns into durable form. Egypt offers an especially rich trove of these fragments. At Deir el-Medina, the workers who carved and decorated the Valley of the Kings left behind thousands of shards. Their notes are astonishing in their range. Some list attendance, tallying days worked and absences. Others record tools borrowed and supplies delivered. There are sketches scattered among them, rough portraits, outlines of tomb inscriptions, even practice drawings planning funerary paintings. A single ostrakon could hold a draft inscription on one side and a doodle or calculation on the other. These pieces bring to life a community of artisans solving real problems with whatever surface lay close at hand. The mechanics of creating ostraka required no special effort. Broken ceramics were ubiquitous, and people typically selected palm-sized fragments with flat, light-colored surfaces. Writing tools were simple: reed pens dipped in carbon black ink, or sometimes just a sharp object scratching into the glaze. There was no need for preparation, unlike papyrus processing or the stretching of parchment. This simplicity meant that scraps of pottery functioned as a nearly endless, free supply of writing material. Archaeologists often find ostraka clustered in telling locations. Around temples, fragments record offerings, donations, or festival arrangements. At houses, they reveal shopping reminders, debt tallies, and casual correspondence. In the ruins of administrative centers, piles of shards bear tax records, receipts, and official notes. The context in which they appear gives us a sense of their function. A voting pile in Athens, work logs at Deir el-Medina, bureaucratic waste bins along the Nile. Unlike carefully curated inscriptions carved in stone, these shards often accumulated as casual discard, leaving behind an unfiltered archive of daily life. One frequent use was for taxation and economic record-keeping. An ostrakon from Egypt tracks wine deliveries across the months of the year. Another lists quantities of linen collected as tribute on Elephantine Island. These weren't decorative lists. They were functional tools of administration that could be updated quickly, fragment by fragment. In some cases, calculations appear alongside lists, evidence of the arithmetic required to verify payments. These shards are the closest thing antiquity had to ledgers scribbled on scratch paper. Ostraka served military purposes as well. Greek garrisons used them to track guard duty rotations or ration supplies issued to soldiers. The compact size made them more portable than stone tablets or cumbersome scrolls. Archaeologists in Sparta, for instance, display one fragment that appears to function as a soldier's pay record. These finds show how adaptable pottery shards were to the shifting needs of administration, trade, and security. In legal spheres, ostraka were no less useful. At Thebes, one shard details testimony from a property dispute, recording names and claims. Others contain witness lists, verdict notes, or evidence of settlement. Because they were easy to obtain, they became natural aids for courtroom proceedings. Some examples, with careful handwriting and formal structure, suggest they might have been written under official supervision rather than hasty notes. The extraordinary durability of pottery explains why so many have survived. Fired clay is resistant to the decay that destroys papyrus and parchment. At desert sites in Egypt, some shards still carry ink markings clearly visible after more than 2 millennia. This preservation allows archaeologists to hold in their hands the direct notes of anonymous citizens, unmediated by later copies or reinterpretation. When we read them, we encounter the actual words as written. Education crops up too. Certain pieces bear repeated alphabets or basic multiplication problems, their uneven script a child's handwriting. These practice pieces suggest that ostraka were often used outside formal schools, perhaps by children learning to write at home with literate parents. They present some of the most intimate glimpses into ancient households. In a culture where formal education was often reserved for scribes or elites, ostraka show young pupils scribbling repetition lines in the margins of family life. Not all fragments are pragmatic lists. Some capture humor or emotional life. Athenian examples preserve crude jokes or short verses. Egyptian ostraka sometimes retain snatches of love poetry, comparing a lover's beauty to natural wonders in heartfelt, unpolished words. These pieces are far from polished literature, but precisely because of their informal tone, they reveal voices not often heard among monumental inscriptions. They tell us that people laughed, flirted, and joked in ways that connect across centuries. The diversity extends to drawings and games. Some ostraka feature stick figure sketches or rough cartoons, the kind of doodles familiar even today. Others include simple board game diagrams for pastimes during idle hours. These glimpses remind us that ostraka were as much spaces for passing the time as they were for administration. Claims about sophisticated puzzles need caution. It is safer to say game diagrams appear, showing workers recording entertainment just as they did debts and deliveries. The recycling process was equally intriguing. A single pottery vessel might serve multiple lives, first containing food or drink, then breaking into shards, then being reused years later as writing stock. Some ostraka even carry text on both sides, an old inventory repurposed to draft a brief letter. This reuse complicates dating, but highlights resourcefulness in environments where nothing was wasted. Volume also tells a story. At Luxor, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of shards from Byzantine-era offices, many written in Greek or Coptic. These were not carefully stored archives. They were discards, cast aside after use. The sheer quantity suggests bureaucracies producing high amounts of written information, not unlike paperwork piles in modern offices. The difference is the medium: clay fragments instead of sticky notes or scraps of printer paper. Religious communities also carried the tradition forward. Egyptian monasteries used ostraka to copy short scripture excerpts, compose prayers, or debate theology. Some contain hymns or quotations from sacred texts, written as much for personal devotion as for official record. These examples show continuity across cultures and eras. The habit of using discarded pottery as a ready-made tablet crossed into Christian contexts long after pharaonic Egypt. Distribution patterns reveal cultural exchange. Ostraka have been discovered as far afield as Nubia, mixing Egyptian script with local languages. Athenian shards travelled with colonists to Sicily, where the Greek writing persists. Such finds demonstrate both trade connections and the adaptability of this medium beyond a single core region. In the end, what makes ostraka powerful isn't just their variety, but their humanity. Formal inscriptions glorify kings, battles, and monuments. These fragments instead capture a tired worker counting his shifts, a voter nominating someone he distrusted, a teacher guiding a child's pen, or a lover scribbling a verse. Their ordinariness is what makes them irreplaceable. They preserve real, unfiltered voices that were never meant to last yet outlived almost everything else. Today, when archaeologists piece together these shards, they're reconstructing the thoughts of people who never imagined their notes would survive thousands of years. Ostraka endure because clay is tough, but they matter because they hold fleeting traces of daily life, moments that otherwise would have vanished. And while pottery shards offered one kind of access to durable records, other materials soon emerged that promised something these fragments never could. Surfaces smooth enough for long texts and light enough to carry across distances. Papyrus and parchment. The marshes along the Nile offered more than fertile soil. They held papyrus reeds, and with them, a way of writing that transformed how records were stored and shared. Around 2500 BCE, Egyptian craftsmen developed a technique for slicing the inner pith of the plant into thin strips, laying them at right angles and pressing them into sheets. When dried and polished, these sheets formed a smooth surface that worked well for ink. The process required skill, but the result was revolutionary. A paper-like material that was lighter, thinner, and more manageable than clay tablets. Compared to clay, papyrus offered dramatic advantages. A single clay tablet was heavy and fragile, often taking up the space of an entire shelf when used in bulk. Papyrus, on the other hand, could be cut into sheets and glued into scrolls, sometimes reaching 10 meters or more in length. One scroll could hold the same amount of writing as dozens of tablets, but could be carried under one arm. It made records portable. Tax officials could travel with documents, soldiers could carry dispatches during campaigns, and merchants could fold receipts into pouches instead of lugging crates of clay. Not all papyrus was created equal. The finest sheets, whitened and polished, were reserved for royal or state use. Coarser, brownish sheets became the medium of students and shopkeepers. Quality depended on which part of the reed pith was used. Central stalks produced smoother sheets. Exterior layers produced rougher ones. Despite its cost, papyrus quickly gained value across the Mediterranean. Its lightness and convenience gave Egypt an economic and cultural advantage. Alexandria, with its monopoly on high-quality production, became famous for exporting scrolls. Libraries across the ancient world depended on these shipments, and despite its fragility, papyrus spread knowledge farther and faster than any medium before it. Scrolls demanded their own reading habits. Text appeared in vertical columns 5 to 7 centimeters wide, written in ink with reed pens. Readers used both hands to manage the roll, unrolling with one while re-rolling with the other. The length of long text required practice, but scrolls were efficient for narratives, continuous treatises, and collections of laws. Owners marked scrolls with tags for quick identification, and wealthier readers stored them carefully in cases or wooden cabinets. While papyrus worked best in dry climates, it could last for centuries if cared for properly, as demonstrated by the caches preserved in the sands of Egypt. Still, papyrus had weaknesses. Exposure to moisture encouraged decay, rodents chewed through scrolls, and repeated use left edges frayed. In wetter climates, entire archives simply rotted away. These shortcomings encouraged the rise of a new material, parchment. By about 200 BCE, Pergamon in Asia Minor had refined the preparation of animal skins into a medium that could rival papyrus in smoothness, while outlasting it in durability. The preparation of parchment was painstaking. Skins from goats, sheep, or calves were soaked in lime, scraped, and stretched taut over frames until thin and uniform. The tight fiber structure of the skin produced a sheet that resisted tearing and, unlike papyrus, could be written on both sides. The highest quality parchment, known as vellum, came from very fine calfskin and produced manuscripts of exceptional clarity. Because it tolerated erasure and correction, marks could be scraped off with a knife. Parchment suited works that demanded frequent revision, such as draft texts, commentaries, or composite volumes assembled across generations. This durability opened a major conceptual change in how written works were stored and read. While papyrus favored scrolls, parchment supported pages. Around the first few centuries CE, parchment sheets began to be bound into codices, the forerunners of modern books. A codex allowed readers to flip directly to passages, compare sections side by side, and store entire collections in compact form. Religious communities, particularly Christians, adopted the codex format early, finding it easier to handle compared to scrolls when referencing scripture. Administrative and legal circles soon followed, as binding saved space and made it easier to preserve records. The two materials coexisted for centuries. In the Roman period, contracts specified whether they should appear on papyrus or parchment depending on the significance of the document. Everyday accounts favored papyrus, which was cheaper and plentiful, while legal codes or sacred texts often appeared on parchment, ensuring longevity. The famed Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum, buried by Vesuvius, preserved scrolls written on papyrus. By contrast, medieval monastic libraries held shelves of parchment codices, bound and organized for centuries of storage. The choice of medium shaped not only the durability of the record, but also the way readers interacted with it. The decision between scrolls and codices was not just about convenience, it affected literacy itself. Papyrus encouraged linear reading, unrolling line after line through a continuous flow. Parchment codices allowed for quicker reference, enabling scholars to compare texts or annotate margins. They also conserved resources. Double-sided writing doubled the usable surface. These seemingly practical adjustments carried real intellectual consequences, creating habits of study and cross-referencing that shaped medieval scholarship. Even as later technologies emerged, papyrus and parchment represent a critical turning point. They marked humanity's move away from heavy, fragile, or improvised surfaces and toward materials designed for portability, endurance, and organization. Papyrus carried the first great libraries of antiquity. Parchment preserved the religious and legal texts that defined medieval Europe, and through their distinct formats, scrolls and codices, they fundamentally changed not only how information could survive, but how people accessed it. By reshaping record-keeping into portable rolls and durable books, these materials helped manage information with a clarity impossible in earlier systems. That ability to store, access, and verify records set the stage for even deeper changes ahead, because as archives grew and transactions increased, it wasn't just the surface for writing that mattered. Societies would also have to invent new ways of tracking value itself. Double-entry bookkeeping in Renaissance Italy, a Franciscan friar named Luca Pacioli published a mathematics textbook in 1494 that changed how commerce worked. His Summa de Arithmetica included a 27-page section outlining a system known as double-entry bookkeeping. Merchants in Lombardy and Florence had already experimented with similar methods, but Pacioli's clear explanation and systematic rules spread the practice widely across Europe. He wasn't the inventor, but he became its great popularizer, giving merchants and bankers a uniform framework for their accounts. At its core, the idea was simple. Every financial transaction has two sides. In double-entry bookkeeping, you record both a debit and a credit so that the accounts remain in balance. For example, if a trader sold wool, the increase in cash would be entered as a debit and the decrease in inventory would be recorded as a credit. The books had to align because assets were balanced against liabilities and equity. If the numbers didn't match, something was wrong. This built-in check was the breakthrough that made the system so powerful. Merchants of the late Middle Ages badly needed such reliability. Trade routes stretched thousands of miles, with goods moving across seas and through long caravans. Cargo was often sold on credit, and payments might not arrive for months. Under single-entry systems, only money in and out was written down, making it difficult to track obligations across different ventures. With double entry, every action reflected both its cost and its gain, reducing mistakes and discouraging fraud. A shipload of spices or cloth could now be followed from purchase to sale in a way that was verifiable across partners. Pacioli also described how to structure the books themselves. He outlined 3 parts: a memorandum for jotting down daily transactions, a journal for categorizing them, and a ledger for compiling the full financial picture. He even included procedures like trial balances and balance sheets, practices still recognizable in modern accounting. His Summa became immensely popular, copied widely, and used well beyond Italy, because it provided a toolkit that could be adapted to different kinds of businesses. The system's genius was its self-correcting nature. Suppose a merchant mistakenly left out part of a payment. The imbalance between debits and credits would appear instantly, signaling the error. Some surviving ledgers show handwritten notes beside entries as bookkeepers struggled to track down minor discrepancies. The method offered clarity in a world where small errors could ruin fortunes. It gave merchants confidence that their accounts represented reality, and it allowed them to share records openly with creditors and partners. The timing of Pacioli's book was crucial. Europe's economy was expanding rapidly in the 15th century, with banking families like the Medici managing far-flung networks of trade and credit. Lent money crossed borders as frequently as goods themselves. Double entry gave these families the means to assess risk across branches in Florence, Venice, or Bruges. A ledger in one city could be matched against records in another, proving whether funds were accounted for correctly. The result was stronger trust and smoother cooperation between trading partners. Of course, adopting the new method required training. Merchants, who were used to informal notes or memorized numbers, now relied on clerks and scribes schooled in Pacioli's approach. Firms developed their own variations in notation. Debits marked one way, credits another. Some even adopted color codes: black ink for income, red ink for expenses, a distinction still seen when people speak of being in the red. Resistance persisted for decades, especially among smaller shopkeepers who clung to simpler entries. But by the 1600s, the advantages were too hard to ignore. Colonial expansion only spread the method further. Portuguese traders balanced their spice shipments from India with double-entry records. Spanish officials used the technique to track immense flows of silver from the mines of the Americas. The Dutch East India Company, often called the first multinational corporation, maintained extensive ledgers across continents, its very survival depending on exact accounting. Wherever trade demanded transparency between distant partners, double entry proved essential. The Industrial Revolution raised new challenges that the system also helped solve. Factory owners used double entry to measure raw materials against finished goods, keeping track of production costs and profits. British East India Company records from the 1700s illustrate shipments of tea, with transport and customs fees meticulously offset against sales revenues. The precision of these books made it possible to manage large organizations long before the appearance of mechanical or digital aids. The influence of double-entry bookkeeping extended beyond business. Its structure fostered habits of organizing problems in opposing pairs, debit and credit, error and correction. Renaissance thinkers valued Pacioli not only as an accountant, but also as a mathematician whose framework reflected rational order. Some historians argue the method influenced broader patterns of thought associated with early capitalism, changing how people measured value and consequence. Even as methods advanced, the core remained unchanged. Modern software packages still operate on Pacioli's framework, turning every purchase, payment, or payroll entry into matching debits and credits. Today's terms continue their Latin roots. Credit from creditum, meaning entrusted, and debit from debitum, meaning what is owed. The digital systems may be faster, but their skeleton looks remarkably similar to those pages drawn up in Renaissance Venice. Critiques of the system also surfaced. Some anthropologists observe that double entry reduces relationships to numerical exchanges, simplifying social or environmental costs that never appear in the ledgers. Historians note that by enabling precise accumulation of wealth, it helped fuel patterns of inequality. Environmentalists point out that pollution or resource depletion rarely gets counted as a debit, even when it represents a real cost to society. These criticisms highlight both the usefulness and the limits of the method. Cultural echoes of its significance can be found across history. Painters depicted merchants and moneylenders hunched over books, their seriousness reflecting the weight of balanced accounts. Writers of the Renaissance, like Shakespeare, included contracts and precise loan terms influenced by the clarity of new bookkeeping. Everyday speech gained phrases like cooking the books, which still describe attempts to manipulate records. In each case, the system had pushed accounting into the center of commerce and even art. Archaeological discoveries continue to add nuance. Merchant letters from 15th century Bruges reference bookkeeping methods that resemble double entry prior to Pacioli's publication, showing how widely it was already spreading before being codified. Italian archives preserve early ledgers where merchants experimented with balancing techniques, suggesting the system had grown gradually out of practice rather than from sudden invention. Pacioli gave it shape and language, not birth. Global adoption was uneven. Ottoman traders clung to single-entry books far longer, while Chinese merchants developed their own detailed systems without adopting debit-credit symmetry. Japan only brought in Pacioli's methods fully during the Meiji reforms of the 19th century, when Western techniques were being systematically introduced. Each case illustrates how practical demands, cultural context, and political choices shaped whether double entry spread quickly or slowly. Financial crises tested its resilience. The South Sea Bubble of 1720 illustrated that neat ledgers could hide reckless speculation. And centuries later, the 2008 financial crisis revealed how complex financial instruments outpaced traditional accounting's ability to capture risk. Still, reforms generally pointed toward more rigorous double-entry standards, a testament to the enduring strength of the principle. Personal account books bring its impact to life in human terms. Venetian widows use ledgers to track small businesses, balancing household expenses alongside modest charitable donations. In early America, merchants recorded not only profits from trade, but also personal reflections tied to those entries. These ledgers serve as diaries written in numbers, providing glimpses into moral choices as well as commercial ones. Today, museums and archives preserve such books as cultural heritage, from the Medici family's massive lending records to the Hudson's Bay Company's centuries of fur trade accounts. They are not just financial documents, but chronicles of entire societies built around exchange and trust. Each page demonstrates the same discipline Pacioli described 5 centuries ago. Next time you glance at an invoice or check your bank account, you are following the same underlying logic. No entry exists in isolation, and every exchange requires balance. Double-entry bookkeeping gave the modern world a dependable language of trust in trade, finance, and governance. But as commerce expanded further, even the neatest handwritten ledgers soon reached their limit. Growing states and businesses needed tools faster than pen and paper could handle, a new way for machines to help people keep count. Punch cards. The 1890 U.S. Census was about to collapse under its own weight. More than 63 million Americans needed to be counted, their details copied onto handwritten schedules. Past censuses had taken nearly a decade to tabulate, and the constitutional deadline demanded a faster solution. That's when a young engineer named Herman Hollerith introduced something new, a machine that could read patterns of holes punched into stiff paper cards and tally results automatically. What once seemed impossible suddenly became achievable. Thanks to his design, the census was finished in just 2.5 years, a dramatic leap forward that stunned officials and proved machines could handle data in ways human clerks never could. Hollerith's idea wasn't entirely without precedent. He borrowed inspiration from 2 practical technologies already in use. Train conductors punched tickets to mark passenger details, and textile makers used jacquard looms controlled by punched cards to weave intricate designs. Hollerith realized the same principle could encode information about people. Each card, roughly the size of a dollar bill, contained positions where small rectangular holes could be punched. These holes encased individual details: age, gender, birthplace, occupation. A single card became a compact database of one citizen. Operators used a specially designed punch device to ensure accuracy as they filled out thousands upon thousands of cards. The magic happened inside the electric tabulating machine. Each prepared card slid under a set of spring-loaded pins. Where a pin passed through a punched hole, it completed an electrical circuit by dipping into a small mercury contact beneath, activating a counter. Where no hole existed, no connection was made. In this way, totals accumulated automatically without human intervention, simply by feeding decks of cards into the machine. The principle was so straightforward, holes making or breaking circuits, that it was both reliable and efficient. Categories that once took weeks of hand tallying could be sorted in hours. By attaching specialized sorters, the system even let census workers divide piles into new groups. Urban residents in one stack, rural residents in another, men in one drawer, women in another. The results allowed something no hand compiled census ever had, cross-referencing. Officials could now ask not just how many farmers live in Ohio, but also how many female farmers over 40 live in Ohio. The machine's counters could combine multiple variables and produce clear totals. When the 1890 census was completed, analysis had identified more than 300 distinct kinds of occupations, offering entirely new insight into the nation's workforce. For the first time, quantitative social science seemed possible. Governments weren't the only ones impressed. Businesses quickly saw potential in this strange card-based system. Railroads adopted it to track freight shipments and passenger records. Insurance firms used it to calculate claims and keep customer files. By adapting a card's fields to company needs, any type of data could be stored, retrieved, and processed with remarkable speed. Hollerith's machines were soon counting mortgages, pricing inventory, and calculating payments. What began as a single census solution was becoming a general tool for managing modern life. Hollerith formalized his success in 1896 by founding the Tabulating Machine Company. A little more than a decade later, it would merge with others and eventually evolve into International Business Machines, IBM. From that humble start, the global giant of computing was born, with its roots firmly planted in rows of stiff paper cards. Over the decades, the punch card itself matured. The first versions had just 22 fields, but demand for detail drove expansion. By the early 20th century, standard punch cards held 80 columns across 12 rows, storing far more information. They included notches at one corner, so operators could orient a stack instantly. Different colors signified different datasets, and some cards were specially designated to trigger control actions inside the machines. With these refinements, punch cards moved beyond simple counting into programmable sequences, foreshadowing the logic of computing. That flexibility came with trade-offs. Punch cards could not be erased or altered. Any mistake required an entirely new card. To minimize errors, companies set up verification stations where a second operator would re-punch the same data. If the card readings matched, accuracy was confirmed. Even so, a misplaced hole could ruin a batch, creating headaches for supervisors. Quality control became a daily ritual across offices and government bureaus that relied on these systems. By the 1920s, electromechanical tabulators could do arithmetic as well. They didn't just count, they could add and subtract, and later models multiplied. Removable wiring panels allowed staff to reprogram tasks by replugging jumper wires. A single machine could run payroll in the morning and inventory statements in the afternoon, simply by swapping a control board. For office workers, these machines were a revelation. At last, complex accounting could be mechanized. The ultimate proof came in 1935 with the newly created Social Security program. Within months, officials needed to create accounts for the 26 million American workers. Without automation, the task would have been impossible. With punch cards, clerks processed names, wages, and contributions at a scale never attempted before. Vast processing centers filled with operators working shifts around the clock, feeding stacks of cards into noisy tabulators. Social Security became a national institution, and punch cards lay at its heart. The human side of this technology began to define office culture. Key punch operators needed speed and precision. The most skilled could punch more than 100 cards per minute error-free. Clerical teams divided tasks carefully. One group punched, another verified, others ran tabulators. workplaces developed strict rules to ensure data integrity. For many women entering the workforce in the mid-20th century, key punching offered steady jobs and entry into technical office work. Punch cards helped create one of the earliest technology-driven white-collar professions. War further amplified innovation. During World War II, the US Army pressed punch cards into service for calculating artillery trajectories and supply logistics. Factories tracked resources for aircraft production with massive stacks of cards, each representing parts and labor. In code-breaking centers, modified tabulators scanned through encrypted messages, demonstrating just how far this once simple sensor solution could stretch. The transition into electronic computing happened naturally because punch cards were already such a good fit. Early computers like Harvard's Mark I, and later machines like ENIAC and UNIVAC, used punch cards to feed programs and data into their memory. Programs were written as decks of cards. One misplaced or bent card could break the sequence. University students in the 1960s learned quickly to guard their card decks carefully. Out of this culture came one of the era's most famous warnings, printed on millions of paper slips: do not fold, spindle, or mutilate. It became a cultural catchphrase, echoing in jokes and political cartoons as a symbol of rigid bureaucracy and mechanical conformity. Though punch cards seemed indispensable, newer technologies eventually surpassed them. Magnetic tape and disk storage offered far greater capacity and easier editing. By the 1970s, most large institutions had begun the gradual shift away. Still, punch cards lingered. The US government used them for Social Security claims until the mid-1970s. Some universities required programming assignments on cards into the 1980s. Only when software became more flexible and computers adopted keyboards as input did the era of punched holes finally close. Yet the legacy of this system remains everywhere. Database records still rely on the concept of fixed fields defined in columns, a direct echo of the card's grid. Batch processing, where large sets of jobs are handled together, stems from procedures developed during the punch card era. Computer interfaces and even voting systems inherited traces of card logic. The very idea of storing and organizing information in standardized units comes straight from those rectangular slips of stiff paper. Punch cards reshaped human interaction with data, bridging hand-kept ledgers and the automated world. They brought order, speed, and repeatability into institutions and businesses too large for manual memory. As laborious as they seem now, they were once the beating heart of progress, transforming census records, insurance rolls, railway tickets, and the foundations of modern computing into stacks of coded cardboard. But as information kept multiplying, punch cards began to show their limits. They could only hold so much, and every update required a new card. The world needed something that could store vast streams of data more efficiently, on a medium both flexible and durable. The next breakthrough would arrive from an unexpected direction: sound recording experiments that revealed an entirely new way to capture information: magnetic tape. In 1928, German engineer Fritz Pfleumer set out to improve sound recording by coating thin strips of paper with iron oxide powder. He created a magnetic medium capable of holding signals that could be overwritten again and again. At first, his invention was meant for audio, but this simple principle, storing information in magnetic patterns, would soon become one of the defining leaps in how computers handle data. Punch cards had carried the load through the first half of the 20th century, but they were bulky, fragile, and slow to process at scale. Paper tape, another option. tore under heavy use and could not store nearly enough. Computers in the post-war years were producing more data than these older methods could handle. What was needed was something denser, reusable, and durable. Magnetic tape offered exactly that. Where punch cards filled cabinets by the thousands, one reel of tape could condense it all into a single spool. Operators saw instantly that a room of cabinets could be replaced by a shelf of reels. The breakthrough came in 1951 when the Univac Kauai, one of the earliest commercial computers, adopted magnetic tape drives for storage. Each tape was half an inch wide, holding 8 parallel tracks of binary data. Vacuum columns kept the reels running at high speeds without tangling. The drives could read or write about 7,200 characters per second, lightning fast compared to the mechanical clatter of card readers. This made tape the first medium where computers could store and retrieve large volumes of information efficiently without relying on mountains of cardboard or fragile paper rolls. The shift felt like more than just an upgrade. It was a revolution in scale. A single reel could store the equivalent of 10,000 punch cards. And unlike cards, tape could be reused indefinitely. New information could overwrite what was there before. Businesses moved quickly. Insurance companies archived client records onto reels that could sit neatly on a shelf. Banks logged daily transactions onto tape at the end of each working day. Government agencies, always pressed for both space and reliability, recognized that tape reels offered long-term backups without the physical sprawl of traditional archives. Of course, early users also encountered challenges. Stray magnetic fields from nearby equipment could erase data, prompting strict storage procedures. Tape stretched or broke under rough handling, and it often fell to trained technicians to splice them back together with thin adhesive film. Yet these problems were manageable compared to the constant headaches of managing stacks of punch cards. The benefits of compactness, higher capacity, and reusability outweighed the drawbacks. By the 1960s, tape had become inseparable from mainframe computing. IBM's 2400 series of drives pushed the technology into the commercial mainstream, capable of handling reels up to 3,600 feet long. Data centers became libraries of spinning reels, their walls lined with labeled spools. Tape libraries introduced organization on a new scale. Racks filled with tapes indexed and cross-referenced, some retrieved by operators, others eventually by robotic arms. A single storage system could manage thousands of reels containing data far beyond what punch cards could have imagined. Standards emerged too, with 7-track and later 9-track tapes, ensuring that data written on one machine could be read on another. At last, digital record-keeping was moving toward compatibility rather than fragmentation. The appeal was not just storage capacity, but also reliability for backups. Enterprises came to rely on magnetic tape for safeguarding critical information. Every night, computer centers produced backup reels to protect against crashes or data corruption. Companies developed off-site tape storage practices that became the ancestors of modern disaster recovery systems. Many historical datasets we still have today owe their existence to those nightly reels, faithfully preserving information when fragile main memory flickered and computing hardware remained unpredictable. From there, the technology matured in step with computing itself. In the 1970s and 1980s, cartridges replaced open reels, simplifying handling and reducing errors. Formats evolved to fit new machines, and techniques like helical scanning increased density by writing diagonal stripes across the tape rather than straight lines. Though details kept changing, the function remained the same: Magnetic tape stored massive amounts of data cheaply and reliably, filling the gap between expensive live storage and fragile paper media. Beyond business, magnetic tape played a quiet but central role in science and government. NASA relied on it extensively, recording streams of telemetry data during early space missions. Everything from lunar communications to satellite images was spooled onto reels designed to withstand shifts in temperature and handling. Archival work, decades later, recovered sharp images and readings from tapes stored since the 1970s, proof that properly kept magnetic tape could outlive the technologies around it. Scientific institutions of all kinds came to treat it as the default choice for saving high-volume data. Large enough for entire experiments, durable enough to hold for decades, and simple enough to read back when needed. The military and financial world saw another key advantage: separation. Unlike disk drives connected to active systems, tapes could be physically removed and stored offline as a true air gap against tampering or disaster. Banks, governments, and corporations often relied on offline tape vaults for their most important records, giving them a measure of security unmatched by live systems. Long after newer media appeared, tape maintained its reputation for safety precisely because it could be taken out of circulation and preserved apart from everyday networks. Over time, some saw magnetic tape as outdated, overshadowed by hard drives and solid-state storage. Yet tape has proven to be the quiet survivor. It continues to serve as the backbone of archival storage, especially for data that must endure, but is accessed rarely. Climate researchers, space agencies, and digital archives still use tape libraries to handle volumes too great and too precious for anything else. Its low cost per volume and long shelf life make it a technology that refuses to vanish, persisting even in an era that prizes instant access. What sets tape apart is its longevity. Paper crumbles, floppy disks corrode, and old hard drives seize. But a properly stored reel of tape can hold its data for 30 years or more, outlasting many of the companies and institutions that created it. In some cases, researchers have pulled intact images and files from tapes forgotten in archives for decades, their magnetic signals still crisp enough to read. That endurance is why, more than 90 years after Fleumer first coated a strip of paper with magnetic powder, tape remains not just a relic, but a practical tool. For all these reasons, magnetic tape represents both continuity and endurance in the long history of record keeping. It bridged the gap between punch cards and digital memory, and it continues to preserve knowledge that no other medium can store as efficiently for the long haul. Compact, durable, and quietly persistent, it shows that sometimes the simplest idea, laying signals down in magnetized patterns, can carry human memory further than anyone first imagined. And when we step back to see the bigger picture, tape is not just one invention among many. It is part of a chain stretching thousands of years, each link solving a problem left by the last. From the earliest tally marks to today's cloud servers, one theme runs through it all. Humans have always needed ways to record, check, and share what matters. Each method, be it clay tokens for trading grain, abacus beads for calculations, or punch cards for population counts, responded to the same enduring impulse to preserve memory beyond the mind. That continuity is the real story. Our records moved from bones to tape to digital files, but the urge never faded. Which of these would you trust to save your records? Bones, clay, beads, or tape? Share your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed exploring these hidden histories, don't forget to like and subscribe.